Hi everyone, welcome back to Featherstitch House. My name's Rebecca and each week on this channel I upload videos about embroidery and textile art to help you get creative. Our Sunday videos follow our Winging It project, which is a 52-week project that I run each year, and these are improvised pieces that I make up on the spot to inspire you to be a little bit more experimental with your fabrics and threads. This year we've been creating a textile journal and we've been building panels week by week through each month to document our passage through 2024. We've taken inspiration from things that are happening in our own lives and in the world around us, and we've used these to create some original textile pieces that have meaning for us. Now, last week we finished off our June panel, and because I'm making these panels up on the spot, I hadn't noticed that there were 5 Sundays in June, so I found myself with a week without a panel to work on. However, as we are at the halfway mark, I was reviewing where we got to in the year, and I noticed that I've created a little situation for myself on my wall hanging. I will explain more as we get going, but we're going to make a little mini panel this week to fill in a gap that I've accidentally created. So we're going to do some pure slow stitch if that sounds like something you're up for. You'll need some threads and fabrics in a colourway of your choice. And so if you want to gather some bits and pieces, let's get stitching. I didn't realise that June was a 5 Sunday month, and we finished our June panel last week, and that has left us with a week with a bit of gap. So I don't want to start July until July, but we've already finished June and there's not much more that I wanted to add to it. So I've been racking my brains on what to do, and as I was looking back through what we'd already done, I realised I've created a little bit of a problem for myself. So I thought we could start by having a quick recap as we're at the halfway mark of our project. We've done 6 of our panels, and I thought let's have a look back at what we've done and I'll explain to you the predicament I suddenly find myself in. So I have stitched together the panels that we've made so far, and I've just simply done that by putting them right sides together and using a ladder stitch up the seam. And if you're not sure about ladder stitch, we were using it quite a lot on our June panel. So if you watch June week 2 or 3, there's a tutorial for ladder stitch there. It's a really simple stitch and it's fairly invisible. They're only loosely joined, so hopefully you can see that if I pull them apart there are spaces. It's not too big a deal because I'm going to back this, so I'm not too worried. So if you remember, back in January we started with our watery landscape panel. You can see I've also put in these little labels, which I made in exactly the same way as I made our planet labels for last month's or this month's panel. So we made our watery landscape panel, we painted our background, we tried some couching to create a tree, we did some printing on fabric to create an owl, and we used some dynamic stitch to create this landscape, and then added some details to the foreground using beads and sequins to make it seem frosty, and then we stitched in some metallic thread to create a sense of rainfall. And this was built around the landscapes that I was driving through on my way to work, which were completely waterlogged because we'd had so much rain through January, and I put in some standing water with some chiffon ribbon that created that sense of standing water. So that was January. Absolutely loved making that one. Then we went on to February and we did a much more slow stitch panel. This was based on fragments. I took inspiration from Frank Skinner's poetry podcast, where he talked about Sappho, the ancient Greek poet, and the fact that only fragments of her writing still exist. I've since discovered that only fragments exist because I believe it was the Emperor Constantine who had all of her work destroyed, and so just the odd little bit here and there remains. And I was so moved by some of her writing, and we took fragments of poems that we liked. I took you through some of the poetry that I enjoyed. We did some fabric weaving and slow stitch, and then we embroidered and appliqued our snowdrops on the surface. And this one has a very special place in my heart because it was so important to me at the time. Then in March, we took inspiration from crocuses. So our colour scheme was built around crocus colours, and we used inks to create a background, and then we did some slow stitch in the background just to add some texture. Then we used some fabric manipulation techniques to create some spring flowers. So we did daffodils, we did primroses, hellebores, hyacinths, and we made these satin sari silk ribbon crocuses with our little orange stamen tucked inside. And then we added this cherry blossom, loads of slow stitch in the background to create an explosion. It was meant to look like an explosion of colour and of life at the beginning of March, after we'd had so much rain and so much cold weather, that the first sign of flowers was just wonderful. Now, I stitched these three together. They're all worked landscape, and that has kind of set the width of our panel. And I have measured it. It works out about 32 inches across with the three of them stitched together. That's around 82, 83 centimetres, something like that. And so that is how wide the panel is going to be when it's done. Now in April, we started with the portrait panel, and it made sense to do it portrait, and I thought it would be great to do some portrait ones as well as the landscape orientations. And I worked out that 4 vertical panels were the same width as 3 horizontal panels, and that seemed like a miracle. So this was our self-portrait that we did. I know this was very intimidating for a lot of people. It was intimidating for me as well, I have to say. It was probably the most challenging thing I've ever done, and the more I look at it, the less happy I am with it. But it's a record. It was supposed to be a snapshot of us at this moment in time, and so from that point of view, it's fairly accurate. I wish I had done something different with this eye, and the mouth is too far over and the nose is tilted a little bit, but I think as a first go at a felt and embroidery portrait, I'm not going to complain too much. And we did it by using a photo, creating a reduction template where we cut different bits away and used it as a template, and we filled the background with our favourite colours and stitches just to add texture. And so that was April. Then in May, we did a threshold. So this was inspired by some sort of meditation cards that I was given for my birthday, designed by Sharon Blackie, who's a feminist writer who particularly focuses on giving menopausal and postmenopausal women some vim and vigour and excitement about being an older woman in a society that kind of writes us off. So this was my threshold. This was symbolic of me leaving teaching, and we made it a door that opened, and behind it was a meadow, and that was symbolic of rest and sort of regeneration and fruitfulness through the other side of our threshold. And I think this is my favourite panel so far. I just love it so much. It's very me. And then through June, we've been making our planetary parade. So this was inspired by the planetary parade that happened on the 3rd of June in the Northern Hemisphere, where these 6 planets lined up in the sky in this order. And we took our inspiration from the female counterparts of the Roman mythological gods that had named the planets. and we wrote some little notes to self inside. I'm not going to open it all out, just enough to show you that there's writing on it, where we set some intentions for different parts of our lives. The first three were our relationships with others. So the first three were us looking out, and the second three were all about looking in and focusing on ourselves and the way that we want our lives to go in the coming year. And then last week we added our constellations and our background decoration just to bring it all to life. And so it was when I was putting these three panels together that I realised that I had overlooked something, because obviously there are 12 months in the year. And so if I add a fourth panel so that it lines up with the first three that are going to go above it, then I've got the wrong number of panels remaining. So I've only got 5 months left in the year after that, and that doesn't work for squaring off my panel. So I've been having a think about what I'm going to do, and I think I've come up with a solution. I do get quite a lot of comments about, I'd love, by the way, to hear from you which has been your favourite panel so far. I think I love all of them, and it's become one of my things that whatever I'm working on is my favourite thing ever. So I kind of move along with the panel, but looking at them all together, I do think I do really love this one, but the door probably is where I land as my favourite one. It's that meadow. I just love it. So I'd love to hear which one has been your favourite so far. But I do get a lot of comments about the fact that I don't obviously sign and date my work. And I think this is becoming increasingly an issue in a world where we're trying to reclaim women's crafts, and embroidery and textiles has traditionally been a women's craft, and women are not remembered throughout history for the work that they've done. And I don't tend to sign and date my work, and there's a reason for that. Is because I post almost everything I do on Instagram or YouTube, and that is me kind of laying claim to it. It's on my profile. That profile is kind of my portfolio, and I don't know, I don't feel really strongly about signing it on top of posting it at the moment. That might change. I don't know. I'm sure plenty of you will have plenty to say about it in the comments. But I thought it'd be good to build in signing and dating this. And so what I've decided to do is either side of my April piece and my June piece, I'm going to put in a half panel. So let me explain what I mean. If I split one of these in half, I can put it either side, and that will give me the width that I need to match up with my three horizontal panels, and it will fill the gap, and it will mean that I can have a completely rectangular panel, and I don't run out of months to be able to do that. So what I've done is prepare two half panels. So I've got one here and one here, and it's hard to show you on camera, but one will go there, it'll be bound and everything, and then the other one will go on this side next to June, and that will mean that it matches in width with January, February and March. And I thought we could use these to create almost like a title and signature to add into our hanging or our quilt or our book if you want to. So if you're turning your panels into a book, you can do this as a complete page. You don't have to split it. So if you're doing a book, you could just make another panel that matches all the rest, and that would be your front page. Or you could do two panels and have one at the front and one at the back with a signature on it. I'm just going to make one today because I'm absolutely confident that we're going to have another 5 Sunday month later in the year, and I can make the second one then. So I'm going to do my title today. So this is going to be worked vertically. I've cut some binding strips, which I'm going to come to at the end, and I'm going to do this in a kind of slow stitch kind of way, and I've picked out some fabrics that I really like. So I've got some natural linen here, and then I've got this striped linen. It's more like a cotton, actually, I think. Striped cotton in these really sort of subtle tones. And they've got this little bit of upholstery fabric. I think I got these, certainly these two, were in a scrap pack from my local fabric shop that I absolutely love. It's called the Fabric Quarter in Lincoln. And I thought we could do a little kind of slow stitch panel, and then I can embroider some words over the top. So we've done our little review, and now we're going to put our panel together. Right, I'm going to start by building my background, and I'm going to do that by just tearing my linen to the right size. I'm laying it over the top. I'm just going to cut a little snip. Don't have to go right to the edge. No, that's not going to tear. Not going to tear. So I'm just going to put that on and roughly cut the right length. It doesn't have to be perfect because obviously the binding is going to go on. And I've given myself some trim space as well, so these are a little bit wider than they need to be. Hopefully you can see I've tacked around the edge on the line. I've marked out the shape that I need on the back, and I've tacked around. This was a little offcut, so I don't have a lot of play at the top and bottom, but I've got plenty at the sides. I'm going to pin this on. I don't want this to be mega fussy because I want my writing to stand out. So I'm not going to go berserk with loads of bits of fabric and extra additions on the top. Just want it to be fairly simple. I thought that just linen would be too plain though, so I'm just going to jazz it up a little bit. There we go. And then I'm just going to add in some extra bits of my fabrics. So where I can, I'll tear it. My grip is not great at the moment. If you can't tear it, you can just fray it after the fact. So I'm just pulling out strands from the weave. Really liking the little blue details on this. And I might add in some vintage buttons or some beads just to add a little bit of detail. Just pulling out little fibres from the weave, and that gives a nice frayed edge, and that will look less sort of deliberate as I start stitching on it. I'm just going to start with one at the top there. Just going to lay them on for the time being. And what we want to try and do is get different shapes. This is a good exercise in slow stitch. I don't want everything to be long and thin. I've got a long thin background. I've just done a long thin piece straight on there, and I'm thinking I might want a piece of blue, something or another. I think I've got some tweed that I might be able to bring in, so have a dig around in a minute, see if I've got tweed that would give a different texture. What I'm trying to create is just difference around this little panel. Don't want everything to be uniform and the same. So got a little square here, and we're going to try and overlap things. So things to avoid when you're putting together a slow stitch background: you don't want things in the middle, so it's not going to look great if everything is lined up in the middle. That's not going to be exciting. If we can offset things, that would be great. Working in thirds is really good. So if you think about a third of the way in and a third of the way down, that's always a good place to start. And we want different shapes and sizes and textures. Hopefully this is all a bit samey in terms of texture. I'm going to take this dark blue flower because I think the bit of green on it as well, so there's a little bit of the khaki earthy green. I think that will look really nice. I do love a frayed edge, so I'm just going to keep going with the fraying, and I pop that at the bottom, and I want something that's going to join these two together. I'm not going to put much more than this on. Let me have a look and see if I can find something that's a different texture. Okay, I've had a look in my stash, found a few things. So I've got this lovely bit of tweed. I think this came with a Studio Flax sort of box of delights. Can't remember what they're called, but just a box of fabrics and linen threads that I was given as a gift, that I think is just magical. So I'm just trying to decide whether I want a long piece of that or a short piece. I think I might be able to get away with 2 short pieces. Don't like wasting particularly really special fabrics like this, and there are ways to avoid it. I want to put this underneath, so it's going to go over that blue ticking stripe like that, but I want some more of it on show, so I'm going to put another little bit at the bottom, and that looks like it's going all the way through, but it isn't. I also found some spider's web. I absolutely love using spider's web, and I'm going to lay that over the top somewhere, maybe there. This looks a bit void here, maybe that's better. I quite like that, although I don't want those ending at the same point. So maybe that's a better option. So I've got a different texture again there. Then I've found some of this trim, this sort of lace trim, and I might want to pop some of that in somewhere. I'm reluctant to cover up too much. I think I'm going to just tack this down before I go any further, because I absolutely want to make sure I've got space to stitch my writing on this, and if I put some buttons on as well, that actually may be enough. So I've got some, let's just pin it in place first of all. I'm liking that so far. If I just pop the borders on, I'm picking out the sort of teal. This is upside down, but you'll get the idea. My border's going to be darker, and so it'll bring out those darker blue shades in the panel. And I've got plenty of those left for the other side, although I might do different colours on the other side. I'll see how I feel when I come to do it. So that's how it's going to be with the border on, and I quite like that. So we've got some extra bits and pieces that we can use to embellish. What I need to do now is just tack all of this down, and I'm going to use my invisible baste. just got some normal machine cotton in my needle. So if you don't know what I mean by the invisible base, we come up and then we go down almost where the thread came up. I've got a fairly neutral thread, it's a pale blue, it's going to disappear quite nicely. And we make a long stitch on the back. Don't know how well this will show up because the blue water erase pen, but we just bring our thread up, go down almost in the same place, and we put a little tiny holding stitch in, long stitch on the back, and that means we secure our fabrics to the batting without having big long tacking stitches on the front. You can glue base this if you want to. It's a little bit of fabric glue to hold things in place if you want to. But if you've been watching for a while, you'll know I'm not a massive fan of glue. Not my thing. And I use it sometimes. I use it for my dress and plate video on Wednesday. If you haven't seen that, I will link it in a card at the top of the screen. So I'm just going to do my invisible base on all of these pieces of fabric. So I'll stitch around each piece and make sure everything's held down, and then I'll come back and show you what I'm going to do on the surface. Got all that stitched down. I've pulled out some buttons and some embellishments. I love these. I believe they were used on like corsetry, I think. These little, or there might be boot buttons. I don't know, but I think they're really cute and I thought they might be nice. I've got some beige ones and some blue ones. I've also got these pearly ones as well that I think are really nice, that I think go quite nicely. And I've picked out some blues and some wooden buttons as well. So we'll come to those in a bit. I've also picked out some threads. I'm keeping this one really simple. So I've got some of my Sheepies Maxi Sweet Treats. I don't know whether these are still available. I think they're now called Sugar Rush and they're much bigger balls, but I might be wrong, so have a look. I got these from the Wool Warehouse. I'll put a link in the description below. So I've got some of those, and I've also got some Silco threads. So I've got a light navy, I've got a dark pearl grey and a sky blue, and I think those all go quite nicely. It's just a case of adding some stitch, so you can do whatever kind of stitch you like. I want to make sure I've got some space though. I'm going to start with some cross stitches. These are really simple. I'm coming up at the top left, going down at bottom right, and then I make a straight stitch up to the top right and cross over down to the bottom left. Now you can make a line of diagonal stitches going in one direction and then work your way back up going in the other direction, but I find that my stitches are more even and are formed better if I do each stitch individually. So it's entirely up to you, whichever way works best for you. I just like the way that I'm able to work on the positioning and shape and size of the stitches by working them each individually. So that's the way I choose to do it. And I'm going to make some crosses that are a little bit overlaid in different shades and weights of thread. So I'm working with my Sheepies thread at the moment, which is a really good chunky thread. It's probably a little bit thicker than an 8 perlé, not as thick as a 5 though, so it's somewhere in between. I think it's originally intended as a crochet cotton, but I think it works really well. It stitches beautifully. It's a lovely matte texture as well, so this is a thread that I really love working with on slow stitch. I'm going to try and work in odd numbers as well, so I think I'm going to start with quite a long line of these, so maybe 7 stitches, and I think visually odd numbers work really nicely because your eye isn't constantly trying to balance and find the midway point. So whatever I add will probably be in sets of odd numbers. So I'm doing 7 stitches here, and then I'm going to come back in with a different thread and make some crosses that are slightly smaller just over the top. Another thing to think about when you're slow stitching is balance, and I tend to work in one colour at a time and make sure there's a scattering of that colour across the piece. So I'm coming in now at the bottom with some cross stitches in the same thread, and I'll probably keep stitching until I've run out of thread, just scattering this colour across the panel to make sure that my eye isn't drawn into one particular place by a dominant colour. This is quite a strong colour to use, and so this is going to draw the eye more so than the pale green or the beige. And so I want to make sure that my eye is led around the piece. It's a really good composition technique to use a strongly coloured thread to kind of steer the eye around whatever you're stitching. We also want to create some balance by working in different directions. So I've done 2 vertical lines of cross stitches here, and I just want to add in some horizontal. So we don't want everything to be on the vertical because there's going to be a very downward direction to our piece if we do that. So I'm just going to add a little bit of stitch that works horizontally, and it also kind of frames that really nice floral fabric at the bottom, and so I think it's going to work on 2 levels. So now I've got some of my beige thread, and I'm going to come back in and add another layer of cross stitches. So these are a little bit smaller, and I'm working them just over the right hand side of those dark blue ones that I've put in. This is going to sort of blur the edges and make it a little bit less stark, so it just sort of softens everything up. And layering, I think, is a really nice technique in slow stitch, so adding layers of stitch works really nicely. Now what we don't want is for all our lines of stitch to begin and end in the same places, because it's going to make it really blocky and it's going to form really hard lines and start and stop points across our piece. So you might be able to see just there at the top of the screen that I've started this line of cross stitches a little bit below that blue line, and I'm going to stop short of the bottom, and again it's another way of softening everything up. So I think I'll stop there, that, and now I'm coming in again with my light green, and I'm going to make some even smaller stitches across to the left. And again, I've thought about where my line of cross stitches is starting. I'm probably 2/3 of the way down the beige layer and just below the halfway mark on the dark blue layer. So again, my start and end points are all a bit different. I think I'll stitch this a lot further down into that spider's web that's over the tweed, and that's going to kind of pull our eye down the piece into a different section. So we want to use our colour and stitch to kind of add interest all over the piece, and we want everything to be slightly different to everything else on the piece. So I don't want to repeat things too much. So if I repeat a stitch, I'm going to do it in a different combination elsewhere on the panel, and I'm going to do different stitches in different parts of the panel, and that's just going to create some movement in the composition and make sure it's interesting to look at, and that's one of the keys I think in a panel like this. Cross stitch is a really nice stitch to use on slow stitch pieces, but probably my favourite one is running stitch. So I'm carrying on with the same pale green sheepies thread. I've just switched across to the other side of that spider's web, and I'm just going to add a line of running stitch that runs down the side of the panel. Now the advantage to this is that it's also going to join up some of the elements of the composition. So I'm going to make this line of running stitch blur that line between the spider's web and the tweed and that floral piece that I've put at the bottom. It's the bottom, I'm holding the piece upside down. So I'm just going to make that line run into that floral panel, and that will lend a bit of harmony to the composition. So our stitch is not just quilting all those layers together and adding some visual interest to the panel, but it's also going to create some links between different elements and pull the panel together. So again, think about where you can add stitch to connect different parts of your piece together. I think I'm going to run this line almost down to the bottom, and that's going to pull together that bottom half of the piece. And then when I get to the bottom, I'm going to actually make a double line here. So until I run out of thread, I'm just going to turn around and stitch back up in the opposite direction. So I'm going through multiple layers, and I could probably do with a sharper needle as well. That's why I'm struggling a little bit to get this through. I'm not very good at replacing needles and changing them when they get blunt, but I think I am due for some new needles. So you can see I've just turned my panel around, and I'm going to just work back up, trying to align the stitches, but I'm not going to fuss too much about it. We've got a little bit more green, and I'm going to add some more running stitch at the top. I've still got some thread left over. This time I'm going to work it horizontally. So again, I'm using these threads to blur the edges between that long floral strip at the top and the background fabric. So just working my line of running stitches across both of them, starting in the background colour and working across into the floral. And then I'm just going to go back in the other direction. I think I'll do 3 lines of running stitch here. Now I've got some beige and I want to add some more running stitch. So I'm going to make a little block of running stitches over the top of this floral piece. And I really like the effect of this because it doesn't detract from the patterned fabric. It's a really good way of blending in patterned fabric because your running stitches are so spacious that you can totally see the pattern on the fabric underneath them, but you just are sort of merging them and helping them blend into the piece as a whole. So I just carried on stitching, and this is where I got up to. You can see I've added some different textures of thread on there, and I haven't overdone it. I've tried really hard not to overdo it. There's a little line of vertical cross stitches there on the left hand side. And what I want to do now before I add any more stitching is to add in my lettering. So I don't want the lettering to detract from the slow stitch and vice versa. And I thought I would do this using couching. Now, couching we did back in January to make our tree, and it's simply a technique where you lay one thread over the surface, and you use a second thread to make little holding stitches over the top to catch it in place. So I've got some 100% wool here, just threaded it into my needle, and I'm going to pull it up through the fabric. Now this is very thick wool, and so I'm just having to work it through the fabric. I did in the end use an awl to punch some holes to get the wool through, because I didn't want to put too much strain on the wool, and that worked really well for me. So I've just pulled a length through. I'm just going to tie a little knot in the wool to hold it in place, and that just gives me a neat start and end point for my letter. Now I've got some of my Silco thread, dark pearl grey I think it's called, and I've threaded some of that into a second needle. I'm knotting the end, and I'm also going to bring that up through the back, and we're basically going to write with that wool. We're going to form our letters just as if we were doing it with ink and a pen, and as we go along we're going to just hop that needle over the wool, take it down on the other side to put a little vertical stitch across the wool to hold it in place. So I'm just going to work my way along, putting these little holding stitches in, and just let the wool form the letter. I'm starting with the letter A, just curving that wool around and anchoring it down with my Silco thread. Now you can use a thread that is the same colour as the wool, and then your couching stitches will be completely invisible, but you can use a contrasting colour like me if you want to, and make a feature of the couching stitches. I'm a massive fan of letting the technique show, so you can hide it if you want to, but you don't have to. And of course you could just embroider in a whipped back stitch or a chain stitch. You could just embroider your letters, it's entirely up to you. Or if you've got some big letter stamps, you could make some stamped panels like we have on other pieces and just stitch those down as part of your slow stitch design. It's entirely up to you. I didn't feel like I had a big enough letter stamp to be able to make a strong enough title. I wanted it to be a bit bolder. So I'm just forming the curve of my letter A, and then we're going to take the wool up to form the stalk and then back down. This is really easy to readjust as well, because you're just doing very simple stitches. If your letter goes out of shape or goes a bit wrong, you can either just pull some more of that surface thread through to take away a corner or an angle, pull a bit more through to loosen up the line that you formed, or you can just take out the couching stitches and restitch it. I'm just folding the wool back on itself, and I'm going to couch across again. So I've got two lines of wool that I'm couching together here, taking my needle up, and I'm just going to make a couching stitch across both of those lines of wool together. You could make it a little bit loopy if you wanted, make it more sort of like calligraphy, but I am a very straightforward person really, so I like things more simple. I'm just going to couch down that stalk of the letter A, put on the little flick at the end. You can just cut the wool off at the end of the letter. I'm going to take mine back through the surface and then bring it up again where I want my next letter. And I did want to write a year in fabric and thread, but because I haven't pre-planned the lettering and I haven't sketched it onto the fabric, I realised very quickly that I'd made that letter A really quite large, and I wasn't going to get all that lettering on. So I settled on writing a life in stitch, and that's essentially how you couch. You can finish off those two threads if you want to, I haven't got very much of that couching thread left, so I am going to finish off, but you could just let them trail across the back and come up where you want your next letter to be. So I'm going to make the lettering in that way. I'm going to take my wool back up where I want my next letter to form, and then I'll carry on writing with my thread until I've got my title in place. So here's my semi-finished panel. I did go back and put in some buttons and those little boot buttons, but that's my writing in place, and I've also put the binding on. And as I was doing the binding, I just made sure that it fitted with the other panels that it's going to sit alongside, and I'm going to ladder stitch that on to the left hand side of the April panel, my portrait piece, and that's going to sit quite nicely and form a nice join there. And I do like the way the colours in the title panel blend with particularly the border of that portrait piece. When we have another 5-week month, I'm going to make a second panel to go over on the right hand side. That's where we'll put our signature and date it. And I think that's a really nice solution for an accidental problem that I didn't really intend. So I hope you've enjoyed that. It's a more straightforward slow stitch piece. We've now got a title for our work, and obviously if you're making a book, yours will be a bit bigger. You could maybe sign and date it all on one panel. So I'm really looking forward to seeing your versions of this slow stitch piece. This is me just testing out some buttons that I may add on, but I wanted to just sit with it for a little while just to see what I thought and just work out what else it needed. So I wanted it stitched onto the other panels before I added embellishments. But if you check out my Instagram and Facebook, I will put some pictures of the complete piece on so that you can see what I landed on in the end. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you want another slow stitch piece, I will link a video at the top, and at the bottom I'll link the whole playlist so that you can go back and see other videos in this series. Have a great week stitching your panel, and I'll see you soon. Bye.